often framed as a beginning, but it's also a rupture. For many, it's a life shaped before language, often before consent, and sometimes before choice.
That when I was about to be adopted, when the Holt orphanage, Harry Holt, found a family that was willing to adopt me, the nurses wanted to prevent me from being adopted. She looks at me, she said, "이몽자?" And I said, "Huh?" I said, how would you? It's the first time I'd heard anyone call me by that name in like decades. And she said, "I was your doctor in Korea."
No way!
And when you were in the City Baby Hospital, I was your doctor, and I remember you.
Today's guest has turned her life of displacement, disability, and silence into decades of service, scholarship, and truth-telling. More than what has happened to her, it's what she has made out of it. Dr. Mary Lee Vance is a Korean adoptee, disability advocate, educator, and leader. But her story not just carries history, but insight, resilience, and power. And she is joining us here today to talk to us about her journey of being a Korean adoptee. Dr. Vance, welcome to Between Us. Thank you so much for joining me here.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Vance, adoption. It's often framed as a beginning, but it's also a rupture. For many, it's a life shaped before language, often before consent, and sometimes before choice. And that shaping continues across countries, systems, and silences. So I ask you this. What is your earliest memories from Korea? Something that you can remember that's seen or either touched?
The earliest memories, people oftentimes ask me that question because they know that I came over as a young child. And so the earliest memories I have are actually when I was probably in my grandmother's garden, and I like to play with dirt. And so even today, I still have every year this hankering to have to dig in the dirt. And if I don't repot one plant, I feel like I've lost something. So I have to play with the dirt, and I love raw vegetables. And this is probably something from when I was very young and I was living with my biological grandmother. Then my next memories were in the orphanage. And I was fortunate in the sense that Harry Holt, who was the founder of the Holt Orphanage and the first orphanage actually in South Korea, to have found me. And he took me from the City Baby Hospital in Seoul to the orphanage. And I was privileged to have been able to spend a lot of time with him alone as well as with the other orphans. And so my memory of the orphanage and of him was overall positive because they took good care of me and they fed me. But prior to the orphanage, I had been impacted by polio.
At what age do you remember?
And so that was probably around 2.
Oh, wow.
And I think that somewhere along the way between the time playing with my grandmother and being in my grandmother's garden and all of that and going to the City Baby Hospital, I acquired polio. And so that paralyzed my legs. So I'm basically paralyzed from the waist down. And so my walking is actually considered a walking miracle because I have actually no muscles in my legs, and I use my stomach muscles to propel my legs. And it's a lot like how FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, walked during his time. If you ever watched the old videos of how he walked, he walked like a board, like a door that was being propelled by 2 people, one person each side of him, propelling him. And I have that same situation with my legs. Also about that same time, maybe because I was playing in the garden, my grandmother, it was outside, a botfly came in and laid an egg in my right ear. And that botfly egg hatched, and it ate my eardrum.
Oh my
and because
gosh.
as a result of that, I lost my hearing in my right ear, and I have partial hearing in my left. So all of that happened prior to my going to the orphanage.
And this was all while you were under the age of 2.
I was around 2 to 4,
Two to
around
four.
2 to 3 or so, or somewhere around that age. One thing you have to understand about adoption, especially at that period of time, people's ages were oftentimes being adjusted. So the younger a child was, the more adoptable they would be. So a child could conceivably be older, but yet actually be biologically younger.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. But generally, they try to make the child look like they're younger so that they would be more adoptable, because adoptive parents, of course, at that time certainly wanted to have a child as young as possible so that they could bond with them and have this relationship with the child. And the older a child is, the less adoptable they become.
Yes.
And that's why, usually around the age of 12, 13, they're considered non-adoptable. And so there's many orphanages where children have technically, quote unquote, aged out, and they're no longer adoptable, and so they live the remaining years until they're adults, and then they are adults and have to leave. They live in these types of situations, these institutions.
What was your experience like in the orphanage?
Again, my orphanage year time, I think I was there probably about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, was very good. I had a good relationship with Harry Holt. He oftentimes would take me aside, and I would get to be able to be taking naps on his bed. He would leave me alone and be on his bed, and I would be able to be there alone. And I was separated from the other children, so I had some private times. But also then I was many times with the other children, and I played with them. And the nurses were very good. The nurses were actually very protective of me. And again, in the City Baby Hospital prior to the orphanage, as well as the City Baby Hospital, they were very protective of me, most likely because of my polio and my hearing.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
Not quite so typical with other children. But it became so protective that when I was about to be adopted, when the Holt orphanage, Harry Holt, found a family that was willing to adopt me, the nurses wanted to prevent me from being adopted.
Why is that?
And they were very concerned because they thought I would be made fun of. They thought I would be made into like a freak show. They actually
kids can be mean. The world is not that nice.
Yep, and they had no idea what the U.S. would hold for me.
Yes.
And so they even said to Harry Holt, we think she might be mentally retarded. We just really don't think that she should be sent abroad. But regardless, he proceeded with the paperwork, and then I was adopted into the Midwest.
When did you first understand that you were adopted? Because you were still quite young at that age when all of these things are happening on the back end.
Yeah. So when you're really little and you get snippets of memories of this and that, and I definitely remember my plane ride, my one-way ticket to the States. I remember laying on my back.
Were you accompanied by Harry Holt?
No. At that time, what happened was there were entire flights literally dedicated to sending orphans overseas.
Oh, wow.
And so I was on one of those flights, and we had a guardian who was the one who was officially our guardian, and then he signed the paperwork when we landed in the States. And so I was sent over with a bunch of other people, other children. And I do remember, again, laying on my back in the plane and looking at the clouds in the airplane window and wondering why the clouds were so close and confused by that, But then coming to the States, it was an interesting experience. I remember meeting my adoptive mother in Portland, and there were some interesting memories during that time period. So there are snippets. You remember little bits and pieces, and there's big gaps.
Were you informed? Obviously, you were very young when this process took place, but why you were being placed for adoption even later on?
Was I informed? Certainly not by the adoption agency, or if they did tell me, I don't remember, because again, I was a child about maybe 4 or 5, so I don't know. And then when I met my adoptive parents, I think the real first recognition of me recognizing I was different from everybody was looking at pictures. You see family pictures, and you look at the family pictures, and everyone is white except you. And so you do stand out in the pictures.
Right.
But otherwise, when you're just interacting with people every day and you're interacting with your adoptive family, you just feel like you're blending in because they all accept you, right?
So when did that recognition that you were different and then learning of your adoption come?
I just accepted it. I just thought, I'm just different. This is what I am. So it never really hit me. And I'll have to share a story. When I was a teenager in Wisconsin, this was during the 70s. And this was when a lot of teenagers were going to California to find themselves at a place called Haight-Ashbury. And I remember being in Wisconsin and listening to the news about all these teenagers going to Haight-Ashbury to find themselves, quote unquote. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm adopted. What more is there to know in Haight-Ashbury that I don't know about myself right now? And
Powerful.
And I couldn't really understand what they were finding, but then I was naive, so I didn't know what they were actually finding.
Right.
I know what they were finding.
Yes.
It wasn't the same answer that I would have been looking for. Correct.
It's an inner journey.
It was a different kind of journey, yeah.
Yes. Being an adoptee, and I'm assuming, because obviously I haven't been in your shoes, it can come with expectations of silence, gratitude, and just confusion as well. Did you grapple with these feelings as well?
Fortunately, even though my parents were Baptist and Harry Holt was Baptist, which is how they got looped into this whole orphanage and adoption situation, I was not raised with the sense of gratitude and having to feel grateful. Many, many other adoptees did grow up that way. They were adopted into families that were much more religious and much more charitable, as in feeling like this was an act of charity and a mission. And so they were raised with, you need to feel grateful and think of all the starving children in China type of thing, whenever they misbehaved and eat whatever. I did not have that sense when I was growing up. This was not made to me. So
it's amazing.
I grew up being told I could be anything I wanted to be in the U.S., except I could never be the president.
That's amazing, Mary Lee.
And I asked, why couldn't I be the president? And then they said, well, because you weren't born here. And I said, oh, so you have to be born here to become the president.
But the world was your oyster.
Basically, yeah. So that's how I was raised. I was raised early on that I was going to go to college. I was raised early on that I was supposed to be, I should become independent. So, yeah.
They really championed for your success.
Yes, they did.
In every which way. So whatever you wanted to pursue, you had full support behind you.
Yep. In fact, my mother, one time when I was in grade school, I was a bookworm. And so I was in the grade school library, which the grade school only went up to 6th grade. And even as a second grader, well, actually as a kindergarten, I was reading. And the kindergarten teacher wanted to hold me back because she thought I wasn't mature enough and ready enough to go to next grade. But my mother brought in a newspaper and said she can read. She needs to move on. And the kindergarten teacher was like, no, she needs to stay behind. She's not ready. And my mother said, here, have her read something. And so the teacher said, here, have her read this. So I read it. And the kindergarten teacher said, well, you trained her to read that, didn't you? So there was doubt about my intelligence at that level. But then later on, I was a bookworm, like I said, and I was reading a lot of books. And I was going for the books that had the smallest print with no pictures because I had a disability. I had polio. So walking was a challenge. Even though at that time I was wearing only one brace on my left leg, that was the weaker leg. My right leg didn't need a brace yet, but at that time just one brace. But still, walking was still kind of a challenge. And so for me, carrying books was a little bit of an effort. So for me, I wanted to rent books, check out books that would be worth my effort to carry.
Yeah,
so that meant
makes sense.
checking out books that were the fattest books with the smallest print with no pictures. So at that age, I was reading Russian novels.
Wow.
I was reading Charles Dickens. I was reading all those kinds of books.
Excellent author, if I do say so myself. Yes,
all of them. Dostoevsky, everybody. And Les Miserables, although I didn't know French at the time, so I called it Les horse overs or something like that. I mean, I didn't know French, but it was a great, great book anyway. But the thing was, the grade school librarian called my mother in, and said, "Your child is checking out books that are beyond her age." And my mother's like going, "Let her check out any book she wants."
What an amazing
Because
woman.
what books are in the sixth grade library that that a child should not be able to read, right?
Right, yes.
So I continued checking out books, and my father, every Sunday, he liked to go to the public library downtown, and that would be the highlight of the week, was going to the library with my dad. And he would go to the adult section, and I'd go to the other sections, and I'd be carrying out these stacks of books, and I'd be reading all these books all the time. So I was a major bookworm.
So just to digress a little bit too, when I moved to the United States, I'd already started high school in Fiji, and when I came here, they said their testing was different, so they actually held me back a grade, and so. When I tried to go into honors English, I was told no.
Yeah.
That's because the system here didn't recognize more of what the world practices and speaks. And so that was extremely frustrating for me as well. So part of my assimilation to this country is when I got that culture shock. That the first summer, my sister and I spent every single day at the local library because we were bookworms. So my mom actually at one point got so tired of bringing books home because she said you guys would read them overnight. Like
it's like a bag of potato chips.
Yeah, you just go to the library and read all that you want. Okay, so coming back to your story.
Which is interesting. Actually, I was going to just deviate a little bit about the testing because I actually failed my kindergarten IQ test. So the IQ tests were, of course, very culturally biased.
I was just going to say, but you're still grappling with the culture, right? So you're not equipped or dominant right now in English.
So you're not supposed to take IQ tests, standardized exams, for at least like 2 years after you come to this country. And I'd been in the country like maybe a year and a half, not even quite. But I was eligible to go to kindergarten, to be in the early, to be of the younger age of kindergarten. And so my parents certainly felt I was ready to go to kindergarten. But anyway, when they did the IQ test, I failed it. And it was just kind of interesting because the questions were culturally biased. For example, one question was, where does a farmer keep their hay? And the three pictures that were shown were a barn, a silo, an open wagon with hay in it. And I thought, okay, they keep it in the wagon with the hay in it because I could see the hay there, but I couldn't see the hay in the other two buildings. But if you grow up in an area where you know that, you understand that. Little did I know until I was an adult and a professional and working at Iowa State University that particular IQ exam, standardized exam, was developed by a faculty member at in Iowa.
So they're developing it in the context of what they know and what is around them.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be fair to people like you or I.
Exactly. Or anybody who is new to the country, the culture, the community. So, so that was my early academic years, was failing my IQ test and having to demonstrate to the kindergarten teacher I wasn't trained to read something like some kind of an animal, and that I actually did have a level of intelligence and was reading upper level books.
How long did it take you from when you arrived into learning the language? And also, actually, let me take a step back and ask you this, is how did you communicate with your new family here? Because you obviously at that young age weren't exposed to anything else other than your native tongue, Korean.
Right.
So how was that early on?
So my parents, when I was being adopted, the process, I got TB, so that delayed my process. In the meantime, then the orphanage tried to say to my parents, there's another child that needs to be adopted. Would you be willing to take her? And so that became my non-biological adoptive sister, who was half Korean and half white. And so she came 6 months before I did. And so for her, it was a much more challenging time because she was 8 years old. She was older than I was. And for her, learning English was more difficult. But I came over when I was technically like 4 or 5. And so at that age, you pick up things so quickly. You're like a little sponge. And so I learned English a lot quicker than her. But the first few months, I believe that we taught Korean to each other. And because she still knew Korean, of course,
Yeah.
and I knew Korean. And meanwhile, my adoptive mother, my parents had picked up, they did have a basic Korean book.
Oh, that's
and
great.
So they were trying very hard to speak Korean, with their little vocabulary words. So we kind of struggled, I think, together. But again, like I said, I was young enough that I picked up things really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And before long, I was the one that was editing my sister's work because she didn't know English well enough to be able to feel confident with her writing.
Right.
So she would give me letters to ask me to edit them, and I would be editing them for her and teaching her how to get through some of the grammar.
From what you remember of those early times, how long, to the best of your recollection, did it take for you to really assimilate and become the family as one blended whole unit?
Well, one can never truly assimilate.
Yes.
One can acculturate. And so certainly within the protected little bubble of my family that knew who I was and knew the family that was safe, within the protective bubble of the church that my parents were active in, I was safe. Going to school where people didn't know me, didn't know my background, didn't know my parents as well, that was a less protective bubble. And then that became more awkward, and that was one where there was bullying, there was taunts, there were other forms of things that would happen. And, and as I got older and certainly moved out of that whole community and went to college where absolutely nobody knew anybody, that was when I first became aware that I had been in a bubble, and I had to suddenly experience what it meant to be me, being viewed as being my skin color and everything about me, without any kind of knowledge of my family or background or how I came to be who I was. So assumptions were much more rampant at college, and that's when I really started learning more about how I needed to identify myself and how I identified myself and how other people were identifying me.
So let me pick up on what you said about going into spaces outside of your bubble, right? Mm-hmm. How did you create space for yourself or get comfortable enough in your skin for systems that weren't built to accommodate you, that they were so comfortable with the familiar?
Right. So I was extremely naive, and I did not really comprehend what was going on around me. I grew up in an environment near Milwaukee where when people talked about minorities, they meant black. And so the world was really black and white. It truly was black and white. My family was white. Blacks were bad. That's what I was told in the media.
So where do you as an Asian fit in?
Well, that was a question. And that was a question. And so I never really knew. So I just kind of always lived in that little middle world and tried to blend in as much as I could. And it wasn't, again, until I got to college and really got removed from that protective bubble of my community and realized that no matter how white I dressed, no matter how white I dressed, no matter how white I spoke, no matter how white I ate food, I would never be looking at as being white. I would never be considered white. And so that's when I had to start to understand that if this is how people see me, I would need to embrace it, and I would need to then consider how I wanted people to see me.
Can I ask a tough question?
Sure, go ahead.
When you say, no matter what I did, I would never be white, did you try to be white?
I didn't. Well, actually, yeah, I did. I tried a blonde wig once, and I looked ghastly. I did. Yeah. I
think we go through these phases. Everybody does.
I did. Well, my mom was blonde, and, Clairol had a commercial, Blondes Have More Fun. Showed this blonde woman with long, flowing blonde hair bouncing through the field, and she's having fun bouncing around the field, and so you grow up with this blondes have more fun, and so I thought maybe I should be a blonde, So I did. I was I was doing babysitting one time, and they had a blonde wig in the bathroom, and I tried it on, and I looked ghastly. That was my one attempt at trying to be.
How old were you?
Oh, I was probably around 15.
That experimental age, yes.
Yeah, and I realized that the blonde wig made me my skin, which is considered olive, look green. I looked green, and I looked like I was very sick. It was not a good blonde. Although now I do see Asians that are blonde. They dye their hair blonde, and they look gorgeous. They look cute and all that.
Yes.
So maybe it was just a bad wig. I don't know, bad lighting. But I definitely learned at that time that I was probably not destined to be a blonde.
So let's also, I want to ask you, in your bubble and in the times and in the part of the country that you were in, right? How did you navigate high school? This is college obviously opened up a whole
Yeah.
new world for you.
Yeah.
But how were your peers in high school? Because as I said earlier when
Yeah.
this episode began,
Yeah.
kids are mean.
Yeah.
This world is ruthless too.
Yeah. Oh, there would be, again, going back to grade school and all the way through, I mean, there would be incidences where people would slam my books down. They would call me hop-along. They would call me chink. I mean, there were, I got called lots of stuff. And, of course, back then, you don't think about violent reactions, like today's population. So that never occurred to me. But what did happen was I just kind of retreated, and I think books were my friends, so I did a lot of reading. I spent a lot of time alone. But I also did join organizations. I joined a library club. I became president of my library club.
And hearing you speak right now, Mary Lee, obviously so much time has gone by and, this was way much a different part of your life when you were much younger. But I'm thinking like you grapple with some of the things that everybody goes through, teenagers, it's just whatever, life. It's just life. But then you also had the added layer of
layers.
Yes, thank you for that correction. The layers of your navigating with your disability and still showing up and not losing yourself and being an adoptee and just being able to carry the burdens of ignorant people, shall I say, and then to go home and not let your parents see that because your home environment is different than what you step into outside of that.
Well, also they couldn't understand it. So So when I was in college and I took a course called Human Relations, this was a concept that was very foreign to my parents because they never took a course like that. And it never was anything that they had to learn about called human relations. But the course Human Relations was about working with other people from other backgrounds. And it was very enlightening for me because I learned a lot about me actually in that class. But growing up, I remember, though, there were things about being who I was that I had to be very conscious of. For example, every time my mother would come pick me up from school, and if I had a friend with me, I'd have to say, "Oh, there's my mom. Yeah, we don't look alike." And I would have to say that. And then I remember one time I was a pen pal for a soldier because at that time it was popular to write to our soldiers in Vietnam. And so I had a soldier in Vietnam that I was writing to. And then one day he decided he was going to come visit me. He was like 20, and I was like maybe 16 at the time. And so he wanted to come visit me. And I said to Mom, "Oh, he wants to come visit me." And she said, "Have you told him about your legs?" And I said, "No, that wasn't really part of our letters, but I guess I should tell him that." So, that became one of those things. And, later on, as I've gotten older, and certainly when we talk about disability later on in another time, one of the things that I've become aware of is inspiration porn. And inspiration porn is when someone, who has a disability is, played against someone that doesn't have a disability, and then that other person without the disability is considered the hero of the scenario, the situation. So in this particular case, when I was in high school, when I was going on a date, for example, they would be the heroes, taking out the poor girl, me,
Yes.
And so that was. So I didn't do a whole lot of dating in high school. I just had no interest and I actually made a promise to myself, which is funny, because my brother and my sister, they both married local people in their community in that same town. But I made a promise because I think of all my experiences growing up in this public school system there. I said, I will never marry anybody from this city. And I did not.
I can understand why. But
No.
also, you talk about dating. That is just one rite of passage that, teenagers go through. But there must have been so many more, like sporting and just
Yeah.
teenage things that you want to do. And,
Right.
when you get these hormonal changes and things you want to explore, and
Sure.
like you so aptly mentioned moments ago, it's all these layers
Yeah.
that, unlike a person like me, doesn't have to think about as much
Right.
as
Right.
you would.
Right. And that's a privilege, to be able to just navigate life and not have to
Yes.
think about it. And things just somehow magically work out for you, right? Well, things didn't always magically work out for me, but I just magically, to myself anyway, just accepted that that's the way it is.
And
that
I
there's
love-
that there's bumps,
Love
lumps.
that word that you said, magically accepted, because when you say those words that, with power, then you have the power to
Right.
transform
Yeah.
your environment
Right.
around you.
Exactly. It's like when I go to the airport. When I go to the airport, I tell people, when you go to the airport, you just drop your ego at the door. You just go in there and you do what TSA tells you. You do what people tell you. You don't have a fit. You don't get
Time
angry.
and place for everything.
You just compartmentalize that, and
Yes.
you just go like a robot, because your primary mission and your primary goal is to get on that damn plane
And to get to your
to get
destination.
to where you got to go.
Yes.
Right. So don't pick your you got to pick your battles.
I love that. So I want to go back, because you have spoken so fondly of your adoptive family
Yeah.
and your relationship with them. I want to ask you, do you know what led your parents to adopt from Korea specifically, and especially
Right.
knowing that you had a disability?
Yep, they knew that.
They knew that, and they still went ahead. It's
Yep.
not easy. I mean,
Right.
even for parents who have biological children with disabilities,
Right.
it's tough.
Yeah. Well, my dad was a DO. He was a
You mean-
doctor.
Okay.
Osteopathic physician, and so they had one biological son, and so they had tried and had miscarriages, and I think that there was a point in time, where they decided that, and also they were Baptists, Northern Baptists. Harry Holt was a Northern Baptist, so they were getting information about Harry Holt and his mission in Korea, and Harry Holt's motto was "Every child deserves a home." And so that's how he started collecting orphans and children to be placed in homes. And that's another whole different story. But anyway, but my parents, being Baptist, decided that they would adopt, and my father, I think, being a doctor, understood that the disability that I had, the disabilities that they were being communicated were ones that they could handle and manage, because they actually had to sign a lot of documents that
I
basically
bet.
said that they would never ask the government for support
Yes.
in my care. They had to accept that responsibility. And so I don't think that parents of today had to sign such a document if they adopt a child with a known disability up front. But at that time, they had to knowingly accept the fact that they were going to adopt a child that had some physical disabilities. And quite honestly, at the time, I had been identified as being possibly mentally retarded.
Right, as you had mentioned by the nurses earlier, yes.
And that is not politically correct, but that is a terminology that was used at that time, was mentally retarded. Today, we would not use those words.
Yeah.
But I use those words because that is what was used on me at that time. So that's important to put that into historical context. But anyway, so my parents were very accepting of that. And then they also took in my sister first, while waiting for me. And she's half Korean and half white, half military soldier. And she has memories of having been, of course, growing up with her mother and also all sorts of other memories. So there's been an interesting experience. And then my mother had a brother who and his wife, they adopted a child too, about the same age as my sister. So there were three of us within the close family that were adopted, Korean adoptees.
But, adoption too, from what I understand, is quite an expensive process as well.
Yes, it's extremely expensive. And at that time, I can't tell you what the dollar amount was, but What's really interesting, and this gets into some controversy about adoption and international adoption as a whole, but at that time and today even, the birth mother gets nothing out of the adoption, but everyone else gets a piece of that pie.
Right.
So the lawyers, the government,
everybody in between.
Everyone gets money.
Yes.
Gets a piece of that that fund, but the adoptive mother is lucky if they get bus ride home. And I think at that time that's really what it was, because they were being, for many of them, it was a relief to have their child be adopted into a better situation than they could raise them at that time. Mm-hmm. But as the years have gone by, that may not be the case. That isn't necessarily the case.
Now, your family that you've spoken so fondly about, what else did they teach you other than just life and empowering you about love, identity, and not just expectations of yourself, but how to go out into the world?
They never used the word that I was handicapped or disabled. They never referred to my race. In a way, that void could be considered damaging, because I didn't grow up with a clear sense of those identities at all. I didn't understand that they were identities. I just grew up being, so-and-so's daughter. I just grew up being who I was. I was me, right? But I was never raised to believe I had a disability, although they were very protective of me.
Of course.
I felt like Rudolph sometimes in the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I was not allowed to play the Red Rider, Red Rover games, whatever, because they were so afraid I'd get hurt, But I was allowed to, of course, being Girl Scouts, I was allowed to do various things. They worried about me obsessively. And in fact, when I became an adult and I was actually in my 40s and I went on a hot air balloon ride, they were worrying about me. And I'm like going, I'm fully adult. I can do these things,
but
right?
They also say parents never stop being parents.
They will never stop being parents. And so they constantly worried about I went, as an adult, when we moved to, we're living near Minnesota, they had a Courage Duluth program, outdoor program. And so I did monoskiing, which is you're on one sled. You're on a ski. You sit in a bucket seat with one ski underneath your butt, and then you have two poles that are also rudders. And so then that's how you ski. So it's called monoskiing.
Okay.
And so you do a lot of crashing and burning, and in the snow. But I was doing that. I played sled hockey.
That's
which is
great.
where you sit in a sled, and then your legs are strapped in, and then you have two, the two sticks, the hockey sticks, but one end is sharpened so that you dig into the ice, and then you got to flip it over so that then you can hit the hockey stick, right? I was just acting out my childhood as an adult because my parents were so protective of me when I was younger.
And it just dawned on me right now as you were speaking, and I didn't ask you. Was the Mary Lee, was it the name given to you by your adoptive parents?
So my Korean name was Lee Myungja.
Okay.
Myungja. And so my parents initially were going to name me Mary Jane because of Myungja. But then they realized Lee was also my name. So they decided to keep the Lee.
Okay.
So then my name became Mary Lee. So, but the problem was, and I call it a problem, because they decided to create a space between Mary and Lee. So I have two first names, no middle name.
And then your last.
Right, and a last name. But my two first names have a space in it. So unlike most Southern names, which would be like Billy Joe and Bobby Sue, which are all spelled together, I'm Mary Lee, but there's a space in between Mary and Lee, which is infinitely confusing for government officials in my paperwork.
Right, I can imagine. Oh, goodness me,
Yep.
yes.
And I've cursed them every time. I said, you all did, this is my parents, they did this.
Mary Lee, did you ever consider changing your name back to your Korean name? Because I've and I've heard of people, other adoptees from different parts of the world, when they start this journey of trying to find who they are and they discover their name, there's sometimes that conflict. Do I stay with the name that I've lived with all my life, or do I go back to the name that may root me to my country and give me a sense of belonging?
Well, in a way, I kind of have my name because my parents kept my name, Lee. So for the Korean name Myungja, which no one can really spell and say, actually, that would be too complicated. In fact, I changed my adoptive name to my married name because no one could actually pronounce my adoptive name. So I decided when I got married to take my husband's name because it was a lot easier to say and spell, Vance, versus the other name, which was much more complicated, was German with a umlaut, that type of thing. So anyway, so no, I've never had that urge to change my name, nor have I had the urge to change my birth date. So the birth date, as you also know, with adoptees is also something that's kind of controversial. Because for many adoptees, of course, the birth date is a day when people celebrate your birthday, but it's not necessarily the day you were born.
Right.
It's just this legal date. And so I did find out what my actual birth date is, but I decided not to change it because I lived how many years of my life right now having to quote out my birth date to people for every single thing.
Well, it's just confusing for you, right?
Exactly.
Like life just, okay, you're a year older, another year has gone
One
by.
should not have to sit there and pause and say, gee, when was I born? And so I'm not going to change my birth date and I'm not changing my name, no.
Okay. Well, that's great because that comes with a certain level of inner peace and inner decision making, and to be firm and just say, okay, this is what I have come to a consensus,
right,
and I'm going to lead forward with it, and let's just move on.
I think for some adoptees, there's a need to kind of rebrand and to have, to be their own person.
Yes.
And so this is maybe their way of doing it. I have not chosen that path.
Hence why I asked if you would change your name.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've just created who I am as I am.
When you were growing up, were you encouraged to connect to your Korean roots?
No, because at that time period, adoptive parents were told to raise adoptive children as you would any child. And so we were not necessarily encouraged. But my mother was a musician. And so because she was a musician, she would meet Korean musicians. And so we would have them come over for dinner once in a while. And so I did connect. We did connect with Korean family. And I had an aunt that lived in California, and remember, I'm in Wisconsin at the time.
Yes.
So she was in exotic California. And she brought back kimchi, which I can't imagine carrying that on a plane from California to Wisconsin, but she did. And she brought some kimchi over, and I just remember thinking how hot it was because I was growing up in Wisconsin with Norwegians and Germans.
You saw the spicy food, yes.
Yeah, but at first it was like, this is so spicy. But then later on, of course, I was like, I love it, I crave it, I need it. So all of that. But the thing is that when you're growing up, you just kind of have to accept where you are.
What were your family's traditions then that you remember growing up?
Well, the family traditions were the normal family traditions, the Christmas holidays and whatever. But I will say, talking about birthdays, the birthday situation is a little bit awkward, sometimes painful for adoptees who are not clear on what is their actual day of birth. And I used to always think, before we came up with the term imposter syndrome, I would tell people I felt like a fool or a fraud, like a fool Asian or a fool because I looked Asian on the outside, but I was actually not Asian, right? And I was actually mocked by other Asians for not being Asian enough when I was with them. And so you're not white enough and you're not Asian enough, right? So you kind of live in that kind of weird limbo world. But the tradition I really always hated, and I still do to this day, do not celebrate it or observe it, is my birthday. And so when people ask, what's your horoscope? What's your birthday? It's like, why do you need to know?
Yes.
Because to me, it's so non-essential, not important, right?
Yes.
It's like, what day of the week is it today? It's Tuesday, so okay. But, it's like we don't need to celebrate this day just because you've been informed that is my birthday, my legal date. That's actually not the day I was born. I don't think that celebrating an accident of my arrival is really important.
That's powerful.
But I think what's important is to celebrate when I have earned an award. If I have
Your
published a book.
accomplishments.
Now those are celebrations that I love. And that's when I would, want to go out to dinner with my friends, and and I don't mind being given an award, at a reception, because that was, like you said, earned. It's something that I deserved. But having a celebration because you got born, that to me just makes no sense. But that's me. I don't mock people who that is like the most important day of the year for them, and they have birthday weeks and they have birthday months.
Well, for you, in your context of your life, this is what makes sense.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I also want to ask you, in an article published about you called I Am an Adoptee, it mentions in that article that we were the mixed race and disabled, the Korean rejects, and reminders of a war Korea wanted to forget. For those who are unfamiliar with that part of the history, could you please share what this sentence means overall and what it meant to you as well?
So in every country, when there is a war, there is a need to, when the war is over or when the war starts to settle down, like the Korean War technically is not over. It's in a state of armistice, okay? So the thing is, but anyway, around the 50s, the Korean War was at a point where they were trying to rebuild. Koreans were trying to rebuild. And so there were a lot of mixed-race children born from soldiers, military, at the military bases. And a lot of the Korean women, if you know history, had been made into comfort women for the Japanese. And not only that, but there were also women who were prostitutes, and it was the only way they could raise, money and support themselves, whatever it was, by selling their body. So, but then children were born. So my sister was probably one of those products. I, of course, with my disability, this was a time period when Korea really understood that mixed-race children had no future in Korea. If you had no father, if you had no paternal line, you could never.
By that statement.
Yeah, no, you had no future. You could not. If you don't have a paternal line, even today, if you don't have a paternal line, you cannot get a job. It's really hard to exist in that society. So my sister was one of those people, mixed race, and born to a single mother. If you have no father, no male to claim you. And in my case, the same thing. I was also the product of a single mother. And then also add in disability. That is absolutely not going to be a child who's going to have a future in Korea. So we were the ones who were first being sent out because Harry Holt recognized we were the ones who would be most needing families.
When did your mom decide to put you in the orphanage? Your biological mom, that is.
I did meet my biological mom.
And we'll get into that in a little bit, yes.
But the thing is, at that time is when I learned she did not make the decision.
Wow.
It was actually her mother. So her mother was the one that made the decision. And I think that they made it together to some degree because my mother was single. And so her mother was raising me. Remember, I said something about being playing in the garden. And so this was a decision that they understood that I needed to be taken. And so she admitted that they knowingly took me to the orphanage. They knowingly understood that I would be adopted and sent away. But ironically, it was my mother and the grandmother who then asked their son, my maternal uncle, to try and find me later on.
Wow. Okay, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But in that same article, you shared a story of having gone full circle when you were in Korea.
Yes.
As a guest to Seoul National University. And that's a very prestigious university there in Seoul. Yeah. Would you share that story, and what do you exactly mean by full circle?
So Seoul National University is the premier university, public university in South Korea. And so I was the guest speaker for a faculty member had written a major Ministry of Education grant and invited me to come talk about disability rights in the U.S., et cetera, and technology. And while I was there, I had a little scooter that he loaned me that I could use to go through the streets of Korea. And as I was riding that little scooter through the streets of Korea, I saw a man, and he was very raggedy, and he had a board in front of him. And on the board was a cup, and in that cup was some change. And he was laying on the ground because he was using his arms to lift the board propel it forward and then dragging his body across the street. And as he was doing this, lifting up the board, moving his body forward, I was coming toward him, and our eyes locked. And at that moment, he was about my same age. And at that moment, he looked at me, we looked at each other, and that was the moment I knew. I had a PhD from Michigan State University. I was dressed nicely. I was riding a scooter that was loaned to me by Seoul National University. I was a guest speaker for a major event there. Mm-hmm. He was in the street begging. That was how my life could have been. And that's how I knew I came full circle, because I was coming back to Korea at that time as a guest of Korea.
Yep.
As someone to be spotlighted and highlighted and celebrated.
Who wasn't wanted.
And wanted.
Yeah. But who wasn't wanted in the...
Initially not.
Initially, yes.
Correct.
Amazing, amazing. Now, to the degree that you know, and in your opinion, do you think Korea has begun to reckon with what it asked of adoptees like you?
It is coming to that stage, but again, it's very still paternalistic and so patriarchal. And so there are still issues and questions. In fact, when I was in Korea this last time, I was informed by my birth uncle that I met that he was going to see about getting me connected to a registry.
Oh, wow.
Which I've never been a part of, which I never expected to. But without being registered, you have actually no connection to Korea. But the thing is that, when you are, Korea is evolving, and what they have done now is they have decided that they have changed a lot of their adoption processes. Mm-hmm. And for a while, they actually even shut down international adoption because they were getting so much flack, because it seemed like every time you turn around, you saw a Korean baby in a shopping cart, literally shopping cart babies.
Wow.
Because Korean babies were being exported so prolifically. Mm-hmm. And but anyway, Korea started shutting down, and then they're back into international adoption, but with much more rigid screening, and with more policies and process to try to connect babies more to children, more to their biological families, and instead of exporting these children. I mean, this is another whole different podcast to get into that kind of a story. But, I mean, that just gives you a little window to say that progress and change is happening, not fast enough for many adoptees who are very actively involved with the Truth and Reconciliation movement and trying to get more support for single mothers.
Well, and as you said, this can go into another episode in itself. It's because of the systems of the country, and there's so much historical context of that as well. And yes, and I'll just pause there. Yeah. So and we'll carry on. Okay, when did you first find language for what you have lived through, and why was language so important?
I think I would rephrase and say it would be, when did I first understand and learn vocabulary? Because when you are young, it's like females who have been sexually harassed. If they don't know vocabulary to explain what happened, they're not able to articulate and share it. Right? So growing up, lots of things happened to me, but I wasn't able to share it. I wasn't able to talk about it because my parents certainly didn't understand it. No one else in my family understood anything that related to my physical disability. No, it's your own personal
experience.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but I didn't grow up in a family of all Asians, for example, who would understand this. I didn't grow up in a situation where everybody understood disability and the culture of, disability identity. So I grew up having to be me. And so vocabulary is empowering. And it's like the Me Too movement when women talked about that. It's like when finally a woman started to articulate and express what had happened, that's when other women said, that happened to me too. And then that's how that movement progressed. And for me, it was about learning about how people saw me and then understanding how I wanted people to see me and then trying to figure out how did I make that work, right? Because it's one thing to say I want people to see me in a certain way, and it's another thing to have to actually make that happen so that people see you the way you want them to see you, right? But otherwise, you're just living a life where things just happen to you. And if you don't understand that, oh, I just was sexual harassed. Oh, that was a micro, that was a
Right.
microaggression that just happened, right? But if you don't know that, you're just saying, oh, they're just joking, because that's what they always say. Oh, it's just joking.
But it's not until
But it
you
was
put
not
the
funny.
right
Yeah.
words,
Right.
the right vocabulary
Correct.
that really defines either the heightened implications
And the
or
awareness. And the awareness.
Yeah,
of
the
this-
awareness of it.
That
Yeah.
I like this or I didn't like this. And why did I like it? And why didn't I like it, right? So if you don't understand the vocabulary, you don't understand the context, it's really hard to know how to address
So
it.
language was liberating.
Language is liberating. Language is important. Understanding how to articulate.
So when you had the vocabulary equipped with that, did it now allow you to reinterpret any earlier confusion that you
Yes.
would have had or pain with more clarity and with compassion?
Yeah. It helped me to understand what had happened to me when I was younger. It helped me understand situations that I'd experienced in a way that I was able to not neatly box it, but able to sift it. Because otherwise, really, my life was just this blur of intermingled, intersecting things that happened.
But then how did it shift your relationships when you had this vocabulary and now you're able to compartmentalize and really
I was able to
Label
understand
things,
what I
I guess.
didn't like. I was able to understand what I liked. I was able to understand how to set boundaries.
important?
Yes, I was able to learn that this was not appropriate or that this was okay. But up until, again, you don't have that vocabulary, you don't have a way to express yourself, you don't have a way to really understand why this is good or bad. But when you do have the vocabulary and you're able to articulate in your brain at least, if not externally, then you're able to establish boundaries. You're able to become the person you want to be within the environment you want to be, right?
You've lived at the intersection of many identities, if I may. We've talked about that, being a Korean disabled woman, scholar, professional, administrator. In your early school years, being so intersectional, and actually before we even go further, how would you define intersectionality?
Intersectionality is like when you took algebra, those math classes and whatever, and you got this circle and you got this circle and they intersect.
The Venn diagram.
Correct, or whatever, how you look at it. But then you look at this. In the middle there is me. I used to also tell people I'm like this hand, and that I'm this person here, and these are my other identities. These are my other parts of me. They're all a part of me, but you may only see this part.
Right.
Or you may see that part. But these are all a part of me. So you may know me as being the gourmet cook and the foodie. You may know me as being the scholar. You may know me as being the person that's the mentor. You may know me in these different contexts. And you may not know these other parts of me, but they are all a part of me.
Yeah.
That's intersectionality. So my race is important. I identify as being Korean American. I also identify strongly as being adoptee and an immigrant. I think it's important in this time and age that I identify as an immigrant.
So you see them all as connected, not
Absolutely.
separate.
Absolutely. They are all interconnected, but what has to be recognized is that they are all important identities. So I have a disability, that's an identity. I am Asian American, that's an identity. I'm female, that's an identity. I'm an administrator, I'm a professional, that's an identity. These are identities, these are all important.
Were there times, when you're going through life in different phases, where you wanted to erase or dim down parts of you?
There were times, and I will admit that when I was younger, the physical disability, the physical difference was something that was kind of awkward. And so, for example, any book you read at that time, like Heidi, for example, was a very famous book, and my grandmother loved it because she was Swiss. So Heidi. But in the book, Heidi befriends a girl who has a physical disability. And this girl is very selfish. And she's very selfish, and she is just very spoiled. So that's an image of disability, of a person with a disability. I got a book one time where a story was about a girl who was friends with a girl who had a physical disability, polio. And she was selfish, and she never wanted anyone to do anything that she couldn't do with her. And that was selfish. And so those are times when you grow up and you're thinking like, but I'm not like that. That's not me. That's not what I'm like, right? But that's all the books you read were just those kinds of stories. So it's very negative. And then, of course, the books I read about Asians, they were all Orientals at that time. That was the word, Orientals. And all the things about Orientals were we were all a bunch of foreigners. We were all yellow. We were all cowards. We were, either prostitutes or great cooks and housewives. That was a stereotype for Asian women.
Right.
Or, whatever. And you're thinking, but I'm not like that either. So, yeah, there were some very extremely awkward times when I had to kind of wrestle with how people, again, saw me, how society was perceiving me, and how I wanted people to actually see me, how I wanted to present myself.
And that's why you had to get out of your small town, because you were limited in scope and the perceptibility of those around you.
People who knew my parents, knew my family, were in church. They all accepted me as being a member of that community, but outside that specific small bubble, there were no people that I could relate to. And there were no people that they could relate to that were different than me. So I was the odd one. I was a different one. And so it was important. And going to college and, it was important to meet other people who came from all parts of the world. And I no longer was the only one that was weird and odd and different. I was among other people who were also international and different. And I became very involved with the larger world, and that became very liberating.
I can imagine. We sometimes sitting here in California, and especially those who are fortunate enough to have called this home or have grown up here, we live in such a cultural melting pot that we don't know any better. So when we step outside of California, we welcome in the experiences, but we're also, for me, many a times it takes me a couple of days to be like, oh, why are you guys so different? We are such a cultural melting pot here that we don't see people as separate as such.
I mean, California's a whole different country. But yeah, so there are things about California that are very strange and very weird for non-Californians.
Yes, I bet.
And so growing up in Wisconsin, growing up in the Midwest and all of that, I can tell you that there are some things about California that they absolutely, like the Haight-Ashbury thing, there's just things that are so very different about California. So on the one hand, it is good that California is such a melting pot. But it's also very perplexing, like gender-neutral bathrooms and the pronoun things. This was very perplexing for outside of California, outside, that area of political correctness, whatever. And it's still not widely accepted. And, of course, we know right now administratively it's not being accepted. And, in fact, it's being stamped down, which is very sad. But the thing is, it's important, and that's one reason why I am living in California is because it is great to be in a place where the diversity,
we're more accepting.
Berkeley, for example, is a home place of disability civil rights. Berkeley is the place where it all began with disability rights, and then you're looking at. And when I went to Berkeley, I was working there. I got a job. I was working. That's how I moved to California. Was working at Berkeley, and I remember going into their little snack shop and just being overwhelmed by the fact that there was a whole shelf of cuttlefish. Dried cuttlefish, and I was just like, oh my God, this is not like something you would never see in
other parts of the nation. But
here at Berkeley, it's like this is common. People come in here and they buy this all the time, right? It's like, oh my gosh.
Okay. Now, also in 1999, you attended the first international gathering of Korean adult adoptees in Washington, D.C. It was a 3-day event with an invitation to Korean adoptees from all over the world.
Correct. 17 countries.
17 countries. So when you heard about this, did you decide that, I'm so eager, I want to attend this, or?
No, I didn't. No, I really wasn't planning to go at all. And I heard about it, and I thought, I'm not interested because it's just going to be one huge pity party, because I thought, I'm an adult. What do I need this for? I'm not going to go. But the thing that drew me was that they were working on an anthology. And so the Holt Orphanage, Holt was sponsoring, coordinating this, and they wanted to do an anthology of adoptee stories. I'm a writer. I'm a reader and a writer. So that intrigued me. So I thought, okay, I'll do this. I'll submit a story. And next thing I knew, I was submitting this, that, whatever. And also I was working at George Mason University, which was like in the back door of where this conference was being held in D.C. And I thought, what the heck, I'll go. So I went, and it was very rewarding. It was actually better than I expected it to be. I met some very lifelong friends there, and I had some incredible experience. One experience I had was, which I hated at first, was we all had to wear these name badges with our baby pictures, our arrival pictures.
Oh,
so
wow.
here we are we're adults. We're 40, 30, 50 years later, and we're wearing these badges with our little,
personally.
And then with our Korean name. And again, it was our passport photo. Well, I didn't understand why we had to do that, but we did it, And then as I'm sitting there at this table, because then we were segregated by years of adoption, what years we were adopted. And so we're sitting at this table, and I was in the oldest group. And then this little Korean lady comes walking by, and I didn't hear her because there's so much noise going on in the ballroom. But then this other person next to me nudges me. She said, they're calling your name. She's calling your name. I said, really? What? Why? Who would know me here? And this Korean lady, she looks at me. She said, Lee Vance? And I said, huh? I said, how would you? It's the first time I'd heard anyone call me by that name in like decades. And she said, I was your doctor in Korea.
No way.
And when you were in the City Baby Hospital, I was your doctor, and I remember you. And she said, I'm old, but I came to this because I knew I saw your name there, and I had to come.
Holy moly!
It was freaky, and it was like, the hair. I was like, wow. And then I said, how would you remember me? I said,
right.
How would you remember me? And she said, well, your name was on top of your crib, and every day I saw you and I saw that name, and so I remembered that through the years.
Aren't you glad you went?
And so that was like, okay, that was fate.
When you were at this gathering, how did it feel for you to meet other adoptees who shared the same story as you, and probably, now the context of their lives was different?
It was interesting. Very interesting, and I think that one of the memories I didn't share about when I growing up was of soldiers. People always ask me about what do I remember about growing up in soldiers, and and people would always say, "How could you remember soldiers? Why would you remember soldiers?" And I said, "I don't know. I just remember soldiers all the time. Soldiers." Well, one of the things we did at this gathering was we went to the Korean War Memorial, and I'd never seen it before. And when I went there, I was just floored because it was life-size statues of American soldiers in rain gear crossing a rice field. And that immediately hit me because that was
your memory.
That was my memory, was of soldiers. And so meeting these other adoptees of my age group, we had those stories. Wow. So it was interesting.
What a whirlwind.
Yeah.
Now, you had touched, earlier in the episode, you said, your mom and your grandmother had collectively decided to put you up in the orphanage, and then you got adopted. When adoptees become adults, they often wrestle with the question of searching for their birth families or reconnecting with them. You don't know what the door is going to look like.
Right.
But you have met your birth parents?
Correct.
When was the first
birth
time?
mother.
Your birth mother, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. When was the first time?
It was when I was in Iowa. I was working in Iowa. I was reached out to by my maternal uncle, my birth mother's brother, who was living in Virginia at the time. And he was reaching out to me on behalf of his sister, my birth mother, and his mother. But actually, here's a story about Korean culture. I was told that my birth mother had died, and that I would be meeting my birth grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and an aunt. And so that was what they wanted to connect me with, you know. And so eventually the following, that year, I flew out to Virginia where they were living.
How old were you?
Oh, at that time I was in my 40s.
Okay.
I was working professionally in Iowa. And so I flew out to Virginia, and they flew in from Korea, my maternal grandmother and his aunt. And then after I met them is when I learned that that was actually my birth mother. And so they were so afraid to tell me that she was my birth mother because of the stigma, again, about single mothers.
Right.
And so so the story in Korea actually was that my birth mother had died because they had lost a sister, you know, one of my aunts. And so they claimed that she was actually my birth mother. And so then my birth mother did not have the taint of having been a single mother.
Yep.
So this was a family story all around. And so when I did meet her, then, you know, it was really interesting because they met me at the airport, and I was in the elevator, and as the elevator door opened, as you can imagine, the bright light in the airport, the elevator door opened, and they're standing in front of the elevator, and it's like this, like a scene out of a TV show or movie, this bright light haloing around them. And I'm in the elevator in shock because they're standing there in front of the elevator, and they start crying, and they're hugging me, and I'm like just in a state of shock.
Of course.
Because it was like, I mean, I was expecting to meet them.
But they're essentially strangers to you.
Yes, yes. But it was a very warm welcome, and I have subsequently met other birth relatives as well, another birth uncle, and they've all been extremely receptive and accepting of me.
How's your relationship now with your birth mom and the extended family?
Unfortunately, we weren't able to really connect. We've connected every time we've gone to Korea or whatever. We've connected. But this last time I went to Korea, she was really very ill. She has dementia.
Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that.
But it was interesting though because she had not had a really very good memory. And when I went in there, they had to tell her, "This is Munja, this is Munja," you know. And she was just like what? And then all of a sudden she just burst into tears. And then I, of course, got a little bit teary. And that was her recognition of me, you know. So this was the last time I saw her was in April.
Do you know how her life had been after she gave you up?
Her life actually improved.
Okay.
So we believe she never has really explained it, but she was working in a tea house apparently, you know, like a waitress type person. And after I was, you know, sent away, adopted, she went and got her MBA.
Oh, wow.
And then she became a very successful real estate agent. And so then every time I went back to Korea, she would give me packets of money. And the first time I met her in Virginia, she gave me and my husband money, gold wedding bands with diamonds and rubies and emeralds on them. And she took us shopping for clothes. And she bought all sorts of stuff, including a package of white underpants. Which I don't understand why she would do that.
Okay, but in learning of her success, did it at any point make you bitter?
No, not at all. In fact, the first questions out of her mouth were, "Can you ever forgive me? Can you forgive me?" And I'm like going, "Of course I forgive you, because how could I not forgive her?" Because a woman at that time period, and I think part of that is my maturity, my age, and understand the history, understanding what it might have been like for a woman at that time. She had really no choices.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I understood totally. It was a tough decision. And she had never forgotten me, and I understood that.
Mary Lee, it takes a certain kind of reckoning within yourself, education, and understanding the context, and then putting yourself in that other person's shoes to forgive and say, "I understand. I forgive you."
Yep.
And then also, in a way, say thank you, because if she hadn't, you wouldn't be a scholar.
Exactly.
You know, you wouldn't have that full circle moment
Right.
like you did at Seoul National University with your
Correct.
scooter and
Right.
that man.
Yeah.
But also, if your maternal uncle hadn't reached out, were you ever burdened with the thoughts of, let me go and search for my biological mom myself?
I was never burdened.
No?
I was just totally at peace and rest. I just thought this is, other than the annoying questions you get in the doctor's office, do you have a family history of cancer or something like that? And I say, I'm adopted, and like, okay, scratch that out, But other than those times, I just never felt that I needed to know. I never felt that urge and need. I know a lot of people do.
And that's what I was going to ask is like, there's a lot of people all around the globe who have been adopted, who have this urge and need to find an identity and their roots, roots. What would you advise them or say to them?
It's kind of like the experience with Haight-Ashbury. You are who you are, where you are.
Oh, that's...
I mean,
Yeah.
You may find a piece of yourself, like that doctor I met, at the gathering, and that's very important, to get a piece of your life, that you have a gap in your history and your memory. But other than that, you are who you are. You make who you are.
But what about your roots? People say, I want to connect with my roots. Right.
Well, I'm connected to my culture. I mean, I'm wearing a jacket I bought in Korea. It's got the little Korean thing, I mean, I've been back to Korea a couple of times now. This last time I shopped like a maniac and, and, ate like a pig.
I've been to Korea. Yeah, they do have great shopping.
Oh, my God. I was in Myeongdong. I mean, like, oh, gosh. I mean, I just went to all those places, my favorite places, just shopped like a maniac. And, I do connect with Korean culture, and I connect with my bio family. But even if I hadn't, it's not like I felt a need to connect, but because they reached out to me, I have connected. But prior to that, I went to Mexico, and I really connected with Mexico, and I really loved Mexico. And so, I mean, that would have been my culture.
That's true. Certain places can have a stronger connection than what you could.
Plus, I was fluent in Spanish, so I could.
There's that added bonus as well. Okay, so Mary Lee, let's talk about for a moment, if we can, a little bit more on disability. You've led programs, taught disability law, and built systems of inclusion. Thus far, what's shifted and what hasn't?
For me or for...
For you when you began and the systems around you.
So growing up and as an adult, my first full-time professional position was to be an Asian American liaison at Michigan State University. And while I also identified as being, and by the way, that was the most petrifying job interview I'd ever had because that was in 1980. And at that time, there were no books on Asian Americans. They were all written by white men, and they all talked about Orientals. So it wasn't until much, much later that Ron Takaki started writing books about Asians in America, et cetera, that there were actually books about Asians in America and about adoption, whatever. But I mean, the sidebar. But the thing is that I found that interview to be very frightening because it was the first time I was being interviewed by people called Yoshimori and Kim, real Koreans. And like I said before, I felt like I was a fraud person, Korean. And that was before we now use the terms imposter syndrome. So the Asian skin was really more of an issue and more of my job at that time. But I connected with the disability services there because they befriended me and I, was open to disability and my need for accommodations, et cetera. But it wasn't until much later that I became much more involved with disability rights. And the disability rights process didn't come about really until about 2000. And that was because I got involved with wanting to work with wounded warriors.
Oh, wow.
And wounded warriors at that time, Desert Storm, and we were dealing with the Middle East wars. And there were over 2 million veterans coming back from the wars to go to college on the GI Bill. And it's at that time that I became more interested in wounded warriors and the recognition that what we do with disabled students in college is necessary for these wounded warriors coming back who did not necessarily understand and know about their rights as having disabilities and accommodations. And without accommodations, without some exposure to considerations for class modifications and course curriculum adjustments, they would become dropouts.
Right.
Because most of them, all of them would have had some form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress. All of them would have had some form of other trauma. And many of them would have had hearing loss. They would have had some physical disabilities, other kinds of things that would have had them struggle in a regular classroom, whereas before they were in the military, this might not have been an issue, right? I was concerned about their retention. And that's how I really got more involved with disability issues.
Now, you're stepping into these places wanting to transform, but from the state that you're in, a woman of color. Emphasis on the two words, woman and color at that time. How did you even begin to grapple and try to work to get some sort of transformation?
You know, it's interesting. I've always been, until I came to California, been the highest ranking Asian American female of color with a disability. Always, up until I moved to California. So I've always traveled in a world where it's been mostly white, able-bodied men. It's my peers in as administration, in supervision. And so navigating all of that and doing what I've been trying to do, I learned early on, actually probably very young, that there was no hiding what I am. And I think that that's part of it. Some people can pass. People with disabilities can pass. They can look like they're not disabled. Actually, I'm sitting here. You might not know they have a disability because of the way I'm sitting, right? So in a way, I'm passing from that perspective. But I'm not passing in terms of my race, and I'm not passing in terms of my gender. I'm being very open about that. So people who can pass, that is not something that they would be necessarily. They have to grapple with that on their own. But in my case, I was always open about the fact that I can't pass. So I actually started wearing very early on after Mexico. After I went to Mexico on an intercambio in high school, I came back and I would braid flowers in my hair. I would wear, embroidered shirts. I wore outlandish clothes. I mean, this was also hippies. This is 70s, So I did a lot of really, really out there type stuff. And, in terms of clothing. And I thought, I stand out. I might as well just stand out, right?
So because you refuse to cower in the shadows, that gave you the courage to really go toe-to-toe with the system that needed to change.
Yep. I decided this is what I am. I like bright colors. I like to do this and do that, and I will do it, And so, I remember one time telling somebody, several times telling people, you can skip class if you want to, but if I skip class, everybody knows I'm gone. Because, I'm the only one in class.
And I laugh because I get it. I'm picturing it, yes. But you don't have the same liberty as I guess you would say the normal people would.
I was always the only person of color in my class, the only one with a disability. So when I was gone, I was gone. In fact, I tried to play hooky one time. One time I decided to miss a math class. And I decided I was going to go to the state fair. And so I went to the state fair.
Of course you were caught.
Of course. By who else? My math teacher. Very embarrassing. Very embarrassing.
Okay. Your story, being an adoptee, exists along hundreds of thousands of others, right? Korean adoptees, navigating race, identity loss, and belonging. Since the Korean War, over 200,000 Korean children have been adopted internationally. Many of them mixed race or disabled, like you explained what mixed race was. Born into a country still reckoning with its past. In March of 2025, Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission confirmed rights violation overseas adoptions from 1964 to 1999, which is what you had mentioned, including falsified documents, identity misrepresentation, and coercion. Like the adoptees always knew, as you had mentioned, in their bones, that this wasn't just about finding families. It was about erasure, bureaucracy, and survival. And to a certain extent, money.
Well, it was government fraud, a lot of fraud going on. And a lot of children were being literally torn from the arms of their mothers.
Yep.
and sent away in child trafficking. And that's really a blunt terminology because that is how many adoptees of today would consider adoption, and that it is child trafficking because, of course, the child has no say in what's going on, and the child has been ripped away, and they've been literally sent away. And even at the time that I was adopted, I know a woman who is part Black and part Korean, and she was adopted into a Black family, and they basically, it was a family of all boys, and they basically treated her like she was a slave in the family. She had to do all the cooking, cleaning, everything, and she was just child labor to them.
Wow. And when you look at the scale of these numbers, it is mind-boggling to what has happened to these children. And now these children, when they come into adulthood who try to find their voices, grapple with so many different layers of identity shifts. And, to your point, too, there's a documentary right now on Netflix about the echoes and these misplaced children within the Korean society. And I watched a couple episodes, and it's heart-wrenching. It takes a lot for me to sit through one episode. And there's one where they show this brother's home in Busan where children were just taken in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
And so many atrocities were committed against them. And now as adults, they ask for apologies, but the perpetrators won't even have the decency to say, I'm sorry.
Sure. That's restorative justice. And, that is what a lot of adoptees are looking for. And quite a few of them are seeking repatriation. They are seeking their Korean citizenship. They're doing everything they can to reclaim. And I will have to say that when I saw the Korean War Memorial with the gathering, I, for the first time, actually felt anger.
I felt the same way when I was in Vietnam and I went to the War Museum there.
I had never felt anger before, and I'd never felt, there's a Korean word called han, and I also felt han, which is a feeling of like something is missing, and you feel kind of like a sense of grief. And I felt that grief at that part of me that was missing. And the part that was missing was I had never had the opportunity to know what it was like to be raised by my birth mother, to be raised in Korea. That had been taken away from me. And that really is part of what I think a lot of Korean adoptees feel when they have been adopted internationally, is that part of their background was denied them. And they can't really reclaim that. And they can't really explain it because they got raised in a totally foreign area where no one except another adoptee can really understand and relate to that feeling of han. And in many cases, one of the things I learned at the international gathering was that as each decade went by, us being in the group one, oldest group, and then the next group being 10 years younger, and the next group being 10 years younger, as the adoptees became younger, especially into the 20s, they were angrier. The oldest people in my table, we were resigned. We were accepting. We understood our situation, why we were adopted. But the younger ones, and especially keep in mind, we were the mixed race and the products of single mothers. But there were boys, males, who had fathers who were in marriages, whose parents were in marriages, and they were adopted.
Yeah.
So the
it's hard
whole
to reckon with all of
storyline
that.
changed there. So why was it that a male child born into a family with a couple who were married, why was that child
adoption?
Still correct?
Yeah.
That is so unreasonable when you think about the Korean culture. But so it's understandable that the emotions have changed and shifted with the decades.
Now, if you look back to the version of you that first arrived in the U.S. and the person who is Mary Lee today, what would you say to her now?
It's hard because each adoptee is different. But if I were talking to my
This is
younger
your
self,
story,
right?
yes.
I'm talking to my younger self, and I'm trying to explain to her what she might expect. And I'm going to say to her, you're going to have to be either a pioneer, or you can travel the road less traveled, or you can travel the road that has been paved and will be accepting of you, and try and blend in And I chose, obviously, the road that's less traveled.
Yes.
And so, and I chose that because I did know I was so different physically, so different in so many ways, that there was no way I could actually travel that road where I could just kind of blend in, so.
And what would you say to her about her body, her voice, and her future?
I would say that is a part of you, and learn to deal with it.
Fair.
Learn to deal with it and project yourself the way you want yourself to be projected. You can be the helpless little cripple. You could be the subject of inspiration porn. Or you could be the strong, liberated, disabled individual who claims the word disability, who claims that, for example, I have a motto, and my motto is, I have a disability, but it's not disabling unless I've been disabled by poor planning. And poor planning is oftentimes from others. So, for example, when I came here today and I learned that this was located on the second floor, my first question was, there damn well better be an elevator.
Right.
Because if there was no elevator, that would have been game over, I'm leaving, right?
Yes.
But there was an elevator, so, okay, I'm here, right? So that would have been an example of possible poor planning, and one does not have to accept that, right?
True.
So one has to understand oneself enough to be able to, again, understand your boundaries, have your vocabulary, and recognize who you are and what's important to you and how you want to be treated. And sometimes you have to pick your battles.
Right.
So maybe it's not what you really would want, but you understand, given the situation, it is what it is. You can't go back in history and say, oh, it should be redone, because that you did
It's
the
already
best
done,
you could.
yeah.
You always do the best you can at every point in your life. You can't redo that, but you can think about where you are now.
And how you're going to move forward.
And how you're going to move forward.
So on that note, would you say for other people listening in who may share similar stories, and whether it be the adoption or the disability, would you say to them that no matter how hard it is, you can find healing, that it is possible?
Yeah, I think it depends on if you feel that you were hurt in the first place, right? So you have to first recognize where your source of pain is that you need to heal. And I say that only because in my case, I don't believe that I felt pain. I felt a sense of loss.
Loss, yeah.
I felt a sense of emptiness in some parts of my life, but I was not in pain. I was just feeling that there were these gaps, and I had to just kind of make peace with the fact that there were these gaps in my life. But I wasn't going to spend sleepless nights and, worthless efforts trying to fill those gaps, because I had more important things to do. In my lifetime, I've had several situations where I could have filed lawsuits because of discrimination. And each time I've experienced that situation, I've been told by attorneys I could have won the lawsuits. But I've also said to myself, I have more important things to do in my life than to be put on hold for this particular situation. I have a life to live. I have a living to make. I have things I have to do. And so I've chosen not to file those lawsuits. I've chosen to just continue on pursuing what I need to do to survive, but also to live my life to the fullest, because I'm not willing to waste my time, spinning my wheels on something that may or may not give me satisfaction or closure.
Right.
When you can actually achieve that in your own self.
Yeah, very true. So what does wholeness look for you now?
Wholeness?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know. I think I'm not quite at the stage where I could say I've lived a good life. I've done everything I can do. I'm not quite at that stage yet.
That's far.
Yeah, but I think I'm at a point where I feel at peace with what I've accomplished and my potential for what I can still do. And I think that overall, given all my various identities and the life I've had, I think I've come through pretty good.
I would say so myself. I mean, you are an accomplished educator, a leader, and contributing so much to our society and to our nation. So thank you so much for joining me on this episode of sharing your story of being an adoptee. You have lived in between nations, names, between expectations, and yet you have built a life that is rooted and that is now yours fully, Dr. Mary Lee Vance. Thank you so much for joining me on Between
Thank
Us.
you. Thank you.
I hope her story serves as inspiration and motivation for someone out there. This is Between Us. Till next time.